By January 1944, after months of bitter fighting in Sicily and mainland Italy, the Western Allies stood poised for what was to become one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Second World War. In front of them, entrenched behind a series of strong defensive lines, waited tired but determined German troops guarding the road to Rome. But in order to capture the first enemy capital city, the mighty Gustav Line had to be breached. At the very heart of that defensive network, perched atop a strategically vital high point, lay an ancient abbey, the shattered ruins of which would come to symbolise the brutality of that fight. Over the course of 4 battles and 4 months, the Allies would batter their way forwards until eventually, on the eve of D-Day, Rome would fall. In this video, and in partnership with a seminal new work, Cassino 44 by acclaimed historian James Holland, we'll use the very latest technology, unique combat footage from both Allied and German perspectives, alongside modern footage and veteran testimony to understand the ground upon which the battle would unfold. This is the story of Monte Cassino. In truth, the fight for Monte Cassino was a long and complex one, simply too complex to cover in great detail here. But, like with any battle, the key lies in understanding the ground, so that's exactly what we'll do. But first, we need to know how the Allies arrived here in January 1944. As early as July the previous year, Allied troops had been fighting in Europe, with Rommel's Afrika Korps forced from that continent. Axis forces had fallen back to the island of Sicily, from where they put up a stubborn resistance until finally both British and American troops drove them out at great cost. Retreating once again, those troops had retired to mainland Italy to continue the fight. In September, the Allied pursuit had restarted, with amphibious assaults across the Straits of Messina and a main effort at Salerno proving bloody but successful until finally Allied boots were on the ground in mainland Europe. The fighting in Italy, though, as we'll see, was far from easy. A huge part of that was due to the terrain. Let's take a look. Italy's famous boots, in its most simple terms, offered huge advantages to the defender. With an average width of just under 100 miles, no huge force was needed to hold it from coast to coast. Furthermore, all along the length of the country ran the Apennine Mountains, a spine of high ground which forced an attacker to advance either to the west or east along the flatter coastal plains. Running to the sea from these mountains were a series of rivers and deep valleys which cut through the plains, offering ideal positions from which to hold the attackers. Unsurprisingly, the Germans would use that terrain to its fullest extent. Throughout late 1943, they had transformed the region into a labyrinth of defensive lines, more than 100 all told, which would need to be overcome for any real progress to be made. Key amongst them, in the heart of the country, was the Gustav Line. Carefully sited and bristling with machine gun and artillery emplacements, concrete bunkers, anti-tank guns, minefields, and hundreds of miles of barbed wire entanglements, it formed an extensive network from which 15 German divisions, including the highly regarded 1st Fallschirmjäger, hoped to fight the Allies to a standstill. In order to reach the Gustav, from September to January, the American 5th Army in the west and the British 8th Army to the east had battered their way forward through the Volturno, Barbara and Winter lines, capturing the vital airfields at Foggia along the way, until finally they arrived here, where they would face by far their sternest test. Let's see why. Moving across the front, we can explore the line as it stood at the outset of the battle. The main defensive position here was based on a river, which actually takes 2 names, the Garigliano and the Rapido. It was on the hills and high grounds to the north side of that river that the Germans had anchored their defence. Starting at the Tyrrhenian coast near the ancient city of Minturno, we see beyond that the main obstacle in the region, the Abruzzi Mountains, a broad range split by the Orsente Valley running northwards through here, effectively splitting it in 2. The easternmost portion, which included the peak of Monte Maio, guarded the left flank of the real prize on the battlefield, the Liri Valley. At around 7 miles wide, it was an area of low, undulating ground running northwestwards to Rome, some 70 miles away. It was also the location of Highway 6, quite simply the road to Rome. Not only was the valley vital to approach the city, but it was also the only area in which armour and, perhaps more importantly, significant logistics could be moved efficiently, as of course they needed to be if the fight was to move on. Less imposing but still significant locations overlooking the Garigliano in the mouth of the valley were the villages of Sant'Ambrogio and Sant'Angelo, where the Garigliano becomes the Rapido River. On the far side of the valley, in the low ground, is found the town of Cassino, and to its north, in effect playing the same role as the Abruzzi Mountains, is the Monte Cassino Massif, a series of peaks and hills upon which sat the 6th century abbey of Monte Cassino. Controlling these two heights meant controlling the Liri Valley. There's one other location we need to consider here, Anzio. Often treated as its own battle, what went on at Anzio was very much connected to the fight at Monte Cassino. Much debated and controversial to this day, the initial intention of a landing here was to outflank the Gustav Line, draw off German reserves positioned around Rome, and allow forces around the Liri Valley to break through towards the capital. So now we know, for Rome to fall, the Liri Valley has to be taken. For the Liri Valley to be taken, Monte Cassino has to be captured. But before all that happens, the Garigliano and the Rapido have to be crossed. That will be the objective in the first battle of Cassino. By mid-January 1944, having brought up ammunition and supplies in extremely difficult weather conditions, the Allies stood tired but ready. The plan was simple. Force a river crossing at 5 points, establish a foothold and capture those heights, opening the route along the Liri Valley. Those crossings will be made over several days by French colonial troops to the north of Cassino, American forces in the centre, and British troops to the southwest, close to the coast. When eventually those attacks did commence on the 16th of January under a heavy artillery bombardment, they met with mixed success. Near the coast, and despite some stubborn opposition from the hills beyond the river, the 5th and 56th Divisions gained a lodgment and began a tough fight that would draw considerable German counterattacks. The British 46th West Riding Division, assaulting just here across the Garigliano, opposite the German observation post at Sant'Ambrogio on the 20th, found that this relatively short crossing, seen here as it looks today, was thrown into chaos by unexpectedly fast river currents, flooded approaches, and being directly under pre-prepared German machine gun, mortar and artillery fire, all of which exacted a heavy toll. It was the repulse of that assault, and particularly the failure to capture the German observation post at Sant'Ambrogio, which would have a devastating impact on the American 36th Texas National Guard Division, known as the T-Patchers, in their own calamitous night assault 2 days later in 2 locations opposite Sant'Angelo in the mouth of the Liri Valley. Despite massive artillery preparation, a heavy fog, difficult terrain, limited experience, minefields, well-prepared German defensive fire zones, combined with assault boats needing to be carried some 700 yards just to reach the river, the Americans were repulsed with very heavy losses, as Sergeant Kirby of the 143rd Infantry Regiment recalled. We were under constant fire. I saw boats being hit all around me and guys falling out and swimming. I never knew whether they made it or not. When we got to the other side, it was the only scene I ever saw in the war that lived up to what you see in the movies. I'd never seen so many bodies. I remember seeing this kid getting hit by a machine gun. The bullets hitting his body pushed him along like a tin can. Just about everybody was hit. I didn't have a single good friend in the company who wasn't killed or wounded. Despite incredible personal courage, poor planning, a complete lack of use of supporting resources for suppressive fire, and poor sighting meant the attack was doomed to fail. Let's briefly move now 70 miles westwards to the coast, because at the same time this was unfolding, Operation Shingle, the landings at Anzio were underway. The aim being to unsettle the Germans and force them to withdraw from the Gustav Line. But the commanding officer, General John Lucas, was overcautious and quickly lost the initiative, allowing the Germans to rapidly reinforce the bridgehead. However, the Allies were able to repulse all German counterattacks, and the fighting turned into a brutal attritional fight, as evidenced by this aerial reconnaissance footage of that very ground a few weeks later. Back at Cassino, the initial attack of the US 34th Division, Red Bulls, across the Rapido around Cassino town had also been bloodily repulsed, but a small foothold had eventually been made across the river. The problem here was the strength of the German defences on the Cassino Massif itself, which allowed accurate artillery and mortar fire that caused many casualties. The real big missed opportunity for the first battle, though, was to their north, where the French Colonial Corps had seen real success assaulting up terrain that would be difficult to scout at all, let alone whilst being shot at. With incredible bravery, they twice captured the heights of Belvedere and very nearly turned the entire position, outflanking Cassino to the north. Tragically, it would prove a mountain too far for the elite tirailleurs. By the time the First Battle of Cassino petered out, the entire Garigliano front was under extreme strain on both sides. On the coast, the British had crossed the river and been ground to stalemate around the Osente Valley. To their right, the 46th had seen much less success at first, but after redeploying had too pushed on. The Tea Patchers, who had seen such heavy losses in their opening assault, and the Red Bull Division had been blunted in the ruins of Cassino Town, though had ultimately made good progress along a feature known as Snake's Head Ridge, at the end of which stood Point 593, perhaps the key to the entire Cassino massif. Utterly exhausted and forced back after a bitter fight, it was time for the Allies to draw breath and prepare to go again. Those troops, the next to take on the challenge, were siphoned away during February from the Adriatic coast in the 8th Army sector and rotated into the line around Cassino. Amongst them were a newly formed corps under the controversial Bernard Freyberg VC, consisting of the 4th Indian and 2nd New Zealand divisions. The Allied intention in early February was to use this new corps, which had been moved in secrecy to the area, to launch a further assault, punching a hole in the German line through Cassino Town and into the Liri Valley. However, a catalogue of errors on the part of the corps commander, along with a misappreciation of the situation, led to the second battle proving a failure. Let's take a moment now to explore the famous area around the monastery at Monte Cassino. Here we see wartime footage taken in early February showing that prominence, which from the earliest days of the fighting had become a key political and propaganda tool. The monastery itself sits high above the town of Cassino, which lies on the Rapido River. Below it, closer to the town, we see a feature that became known at the time as Hangman's Hill, due to an unusual broken mountain lift atop it, which looked something like a gibbet. Also above the town is the appropriately named Castle Hill, a key strongpoint for the defenders. As we move round to the rear of the monastery, we reach an area up which the 34th Division had climbed along Snake's Head Ridge, at the end of which, with a memorial marking it today, is Point 593, with its views out across the Liri Valley to the Arunzi Mountains and Monte Maio some 10 miles distant. On the far side of the ravine, leading beyond Snake's Head Ridge, can be seen the foliage-covered Phantom Ridge, and between the two, in the gully, is a track leading up from Kyra village, which was become known as Cavendish Road. At the end of Cavendish Road, in a small clearing, can be found the ruins of a location named Albanita Farm. It was around these key features that much of the most bitter fighting would take place in the fight to come. Looking at this ground today, it can be understood why the Allies, Freyberg foremost, was concerned about being overlooked by the Abbey in particular in their advance on the massif. Despite the German commander in this area, Generals Senger and Ettelin, himself a Benedictine oblate, a lay preacher of sorts, assuring all that the Abbey was not being used for military purposes, it was ultimately decided to blast it from existence. That decision, a complex and of course highly controversial one, is still much debated today, and covered in great detail in James Holland's new book Cassino 44. This remarkable footage taken of those very moments shows the effects of 229 medium bombers dropping more than 1,150 tons of high explosive, plus an entire army corps of artillery pulverizing the 1,500-year-old structure with considerable loss of life. Regardless of whether they were present before, afterwards the defenders would certainly occupy the ruins of the abbey, which made an excellent position from which to continue the fight. A glimpse of the damage can be seen unusually from both sides of the hill here. Not only was it filmed by the Allies, but German propaganda newsreel teams were quick to arrive on the scene and document the Allied destruction of the ancient pilgrimage site. These scenes also give a hint of how useful the ruins could be as a defensive stronghold. By superposing this unique wartime aerial image onto the modern satellite, not only can we get a bomb aimer's view of the raid, accurate to the very yard, but we can also see the ground surrounding the monastery across which the battle would rage in the coming days. That fight, officially the Second Battle of Cassino, began with the bombing on 15th of February and was followed up, too slowly as it happens, by Indian troops advancing onto the massif, in tandem with a very limited attack by two companies of Maori troops advancing on Cassino rail station. For those New Zealanders who were tasked with advancing through these very ruins, seen here as they looked at the time by superimposing the wartime aerial onto the modern map, it was a bloody affair. The 4th Indian Division had it no easier in their advance along Snake's Head Ridge, as one Gurkha officer remembered. But as the leading companies charged into the scrub, they found it was a literal death trap. a dense, chest-high thorn thicket liberally seeded with mines at its outskirts, threaded with tripwires linked to booby traps. In the thicket itself were German emplacements so close that they were within a grenade's throw of the start line and yet completely hidden in the darkness. The German defences were based on machine gun posts 50 yards apart. Between each were weapons pits, each containing one man with a machine pistol and a large number of grenades. Owing to their proximity to the Gurkha positions, these posts were not softened up by artillery fire. The attackers had no chance at all. Those defences, so well described by that officer, were arranged broadly in a figure 8, the apex of which was here at Hill 593, with 2 broad circles containing a mass of machine guns and mortars. At the same time as the firefight raged around Cassino, up at Anzio the Allies were firmly on the defensive. As this footage shows, it too was a bloody fight, with repeated German assaults only checked by a determined resistance and withering fire from warships at sea, which devastated both the enemy and the landscape. One thing can't be overlooked, and it certainly wasn't by the men at the time: the weather. Throughout the first 2 battles of Cassino, the weather had been bitterly cold, with alternating rain and snowstorms making the battlefield extremely uncomfortable, especially for the hard-pressed German soldiers and paratroopers hanging on to the shattered remains of the abbey. Unfortunately, things would get no better for those men on the summit. When the weather did eventually improve, it only brought a renewed deluge of Allied air power, which as a prelude to the Third Battle of Cassino began to systematically target their logistics routes, headquarters and gun positions. By the 15th of March, the next assault was underway, which saw yet another heavy aerial bombardment of the monastery position, followed by a further assault on 2 fronts around the town. Here, the 4th Indian Division finally took the Castle Hill strongpoint, but could make little further progress, with fighting in Cassino town, seen here in ruins on German film at the time, descending into a house-by-house slog, which frayed the nerves of attacker and defender alike. Further up the hill and behind the monastery on Snake's Head Ridge, the 4th Indian Division advanced. Reaching the crest of Hangman's Hill, tantalisingly close to the abbey itself, the leading units were hit by a fierce local counterattack which drove their supporting units back, leaving the bulk of 1st 9th Gurkhas stuck short of their objective and left exposed here during several days of intense fighting. As we spin round now to the rearwards approach to the monastery, we get a view of Cairo village and that single logging track, the Cavendish Road, running between Snake's Head and Phantom Ridges up towards Albanita Farm. It was along here on the 19th of March that a daring tank assault by the 20th New Zealand Armoured Regiment was launched. Moving up that track today at ground level, we see just how confined that approach was, with airborne troops armed with the new Panzerfaust proving a constant menace to the advancing Shermans. After a predictably brutal engagement centred here around Albanita Farm, and incredibly caught on film in real time by German news teams who documented the fight, the advance was ultimately checked, but at heavy cost to both sides, leaving the road and open pasture strewn with burning tanks and broken men. Even to this day, remnants of one of those tanks, now converted to a memorial, marks the spot of the heaviest fighting. By the time that attack petered out on the 23rd of March, so too had the wider battle, and once again both sides drew breath. For the Germans, who had against all expectations held off a massively superior Allied force, exhaustion was the order of the day. With casualties mounting and supplies proving difficult to move up in the mountainous terrain, it was now only a matter of time before the position fell. But for the Allies, who too had suffered terrible attrition, they had the luxury of calling on fresh troops to renew the assault. Enter the Poles. Testament to the ferocity of the fighting around Cassino can be found in that, by the start of the 4th battle, with the arrival of the Polish Corps from the north and the redeployment of Juin's French Expeditionary Corps and American forces opposite the Urumqi Mountains, 2 entire armies, both the US 5th and the British 8th, were now engaged in this area. General Harold Alexander, the commander of the Allied 15th Army Group's plan for Operation Diadem, the 4th Battle of Cassino, was roughly as follows. Utilising his superior manpower, air power and armour in the spring thaw, he would launch American troops along the coast to drive to Rome. Juin's tirailleurs and Gumiers, with their proven mountain fighting expertise, would attack through the Urumqi Mountains and prise open the western entrance to the Liri Valley, whilst British and Canadian troops and armour would drive up the valley itself, And finally, the newly arrived Poles would attack behind Cassino to capture the monastery and the other gateway to the Liri Valley. This would all be coordinated with a cross-country breakout from troops in Anzio, who would cut off the German withdrawal routes and thus seal the fate of German 10th Army. An ambitious plan. The battle opened at 11 PM on the 11th of May with a tremendous roar of more than 1,600 guns across a 20-mile front which shattered many of the remaining defensive positions. On the coast, US forces ran into heavy resistance and progress was slow, but once again the most impressive gains on some of the toughest ground was by French colonial troops, who finally broke through in the Urunci Mountains, advancing towards the high point of Monte Maio at the southern end of the Liri Valley. This move in turn allowed British 13th Corps on the valley floor to cross the Garigliano, this time with heavy bridges in place, and at last British and Canadian armour could continue their advance. Close to the monastery, the fighting continued, with the determined Polish attackers suffering horrendous casualties to mortar and small arms fire as they attempted to prise .593 and the monastery from the 800 or so remaining German paratroopers. Over 3 days of constant combat along Snake's Head and Phantom Ridges, the Poles would suffer thousands of casualties in this now picturesque setting. Seeing the writing on the wall, Kesselring ordered his last reserves up to the Cassino front in an attempt to hold the line long enough to extract his remaining troops back to the newly constructed Hitler line. But it was here, with the Moroccan Gumier, that the fight was finally turning. Capturing Monte Maio and swarming over the hills running along the western edge of the Liri Valley, successive German positions were outflanked, allowing British and Canadian armour to also advance and turn right to cut off the rear of Monte Cassino. Near the abbey itself, General Anders' Polish troops launched their final assault on the 17th of May, and with brute force advanced to the end of Snake's Head Ridge, passing hundreds of bodies of fallen American, British, New Zealanders, Gurkhas and Germans along their way. Seeing that the fight was finally up, the last few paratroopers slipped away into the night, leaving an exhausted patrol of the 12th Podolski Lancers to finally scale the summit and raise the Polish flag over the shattered remains of the monastery. Monte Cassino had fallen. One of the real tragedies of the Monte Cassino campaign of 1944 is not of its own making. Within 48 hours of the capture of Rome, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy had commenced and had stolen the headlines from the success on the Italian front. For those men who had spent almost a year fighting in one of the most vicious campaigns of the Second World War, to see their achievements overshadowed was a tough pill to swallow. Many, of course, would never live to see that day. Their graves today found on the lower slopes of the infamous Snake's Head Ridge, and in cemeteries like this one on the outskirts of Cassino town, lying in the shadow of the monastery they fought so hard to take. The survivors, though, nicknamed D-Day Dodgers in the press, well knew what they'd achieved. That famous moniker, on face value derogatory, took on a new meaning, a badge of pride. The story of the fight for Monte Cassino is a fascinating and in many ways tragic one. It's also one that, when compared to Normandy, has been much overlooked, and it doesn't deserve to be. That's why we're proud to be working with Penguin Random House and historian James Holland, whose new book, Cassino 44, has provided the basis for this video, and it truly is an epic. Meticulously researched and detailed, it offers a fascinating deep dive into an incredible story, told not only through records and archives, but through the words of those who fought and in many cases fell during the campaign. With illustrations, maps, previously unseen material and stunning aerial images, Cassino 44 paints a vivid picture of one of the most brutal battles of the Second World War. If you'd like to know more, especially about the experiences of those who fought in the campaign, we'd highly recommend it. You can find the link below in the video description. That's all this time. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.